Thank you for indulging my absence last week. I was away at a place called Chautauqua Institute. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. I had not until I lived in Western New York, but it's an amazing place. It's kind of an enclosed village of its own on a lake past Buffalo, very close to the Pennsylvania state line. And at this place, some of the most well-renowned speakers and philosophers and authors and politicians, as well as religious leaders, come and present lectures or some of them in the context of chapel. One keynoter, he's Richard Brown. He's a former film director with Scorsese in his former days and now teaches film and the history of film at NYU. He told kind of a funny story, and I thought I would kind of springboard today's message with that. He was saying it to underscore a very different point, but I'll just kind of fill you in on that moment. He was remembering a scene in the movie Rain Man, which if you're, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, it's a story about a guy named Charlie, who was played by Tom Cruise, and his brother, Raymond, who was played by Dustin Hoffman and is an autistic savant. Savants are known for their brilliance in certain specific areas of intelligence, for instance, mathematical equations, memorization, art and music. They have some amazing capacities that they seem to pick up by simple absorption or osmosis without much training, or any, really. But on the flip side, they have a rather severe inability to adapt to any sort of shift in their routine. And it causes, any kind of shift or change like that causes amazing stress and anxiety, to the point, for some, that they cease to be able to function in society in that moment until their routine is returned and everything is kind of at stasis and restored again. Anyway, Charlie is frustrated knowing this about his brother Raymond because he's trying to get him to get on a plane to Las Vegas. And the reasons behind it are kind of urgent. And he's at the airport, and they're looking up at the flight board. And he's pointing to the different flights that are going to Vegas that day. And he says, well, Delta has a flight in an hour. We can go there. And Dustin Hoffman, Raymond, says, no, can't fly Delta, can't fly Delta. And Charlie says, why? And he says, well, Delta has the largest number of plane crash incidents, 362. We can't fly Delta, can't fly Delta. Well, he's looking at it again. He goes, well, there's a U.S. Air flight. Why don't we go on U.S. Air? Well, that's going to right. Nope, can't fly U.S. Air. They use 757s, highest ratio of planes in a crash. Can't fly U.S. Air. And of course, if you've seen the movie, you know I'm never good at any kind of voices or impressions. So he says, well, what about American? Nope, can't fly American. Why not American? They don't serve peanuts anymore, only pretzels. Have to have peanuts, have to have peanuts. And so he says, he's so frustrated, he says, well, what airline would you like to fly on? Qantas. Well, we're not going to Perth, and so we're not going to be flying Qantas. And the film cuts to the next scene, where all you see is the back of a Greyhound bus going away from you and heading down the road. He brought this up because this scene in this particular movie was his absolute favorite scene, and he was talking about traveling at the beginning of his particular lecture. And he said that when he was on a Delta flight to Los Angeles, they showed the film. But he didn't see that scene in it. And so when he got to LA, he called up his friend, who's the producer of that film, and said, you know, I just came off a Delta flight, and I didn't see my favorite scene in that movie. How come? Why wasn't it there? And the guy said, because Delta made them edit it out. And he said, well, just kind of curiosity, pricking at his brain, he said, well, what about U.S. Air? And he goes, nope, not U.S. Air. In fact, neither will United, American, Northwest, British Air, Lufthansa, or any other airline that has shifted their service or had any kind of plane crashes. None of them will show that scene. He goes, is there any airline that I can fly that will show that scene when they put a movie on there? He goes, yeah, Qantas. Change, a shift in paradigm, unexpected and unwelcome change is constantly upon us. It's in our lives, it's in our surrounding environment. It is upon us. And the question isn't how do we avoid change? The question is, what are we doing with it? How do we navigate it? How are we responding to it? The story that we heard John read in the scriptures earlier sounds kind of like it just comes out of nowhere. And what's it really related to? Well, it's preceded by a series of events and conversations between a man named Balak, which is the king of Moab, and who is one of Israel's enemies, and Balaam. The two names are kind of similar, but Balaam is a prophet of Israel. But he's kind of an interesting, underhanded prophet, and I'll explain why. The events happened like this. Balak was stricken with fear because Israel had just defeated one of his allies. And he was very concerned that Moab was going to fall under the same fate. And so now Balaam was an Israelite prophet, but he was someone who had decided to put his prophetic services up for sale. In other words, he would prophesy against Israel for the right price. Now that sounds kind of odd. Today we'd go, well, who cares? Anybody can get up at a TV camera and say anything. It doesn't mean that it's going to affect the consequence or the fate of a nation. But in those days, the kings of nations and their leaders put a tremendous amount of stock in the blessings of the gods in their ventures, specifically their ventures of war. And those blessings came exclusively through the voice of the prophets. And so to garner an Israeli prophet and get him to prophesy against the nation of Israel was a great accomplishment for Moab, and in their mind might secure their rescue from the fate that they were concerned was going to be theirs, like it was their allies. So Balak sent princes to fetch the prophet, and at first he refuses to go. And so he sends a second group of princes of a higher rank, and this time Balaam decides he'll go. And so he gets on his donkey, and he goes. And as he's going down the road, there's an angel standing in the way, but he doesn't see it. But guess who does? The donkey. And so the donkey refuses to go. He stops, and he won't move, and Balaam just thinks he's being obstinate. And so he gets off, and he beats the donkey. And so he gets on him again. And this happens 3 times, and finally, God opens the mouth of the donkey. Now, this part of the story you probably do know, if from nowhere else from Sunday school. Thank you, Barbara Collins. And says, why do you keep beating me? I'm trying to protect you. And he says, protect me from what? He said, the angel that's standing there with a fiery sword that's ready to smite you down. And and the scripture says that then God opens his eyes, he sees the angel, and suddenly he understands. And then he says this. He offers first his apology. Great guy. And because he was going to agree to prophesy against Israel for money. So he apologizes, and then he says, if you want, I'll turn around and go back home. In fact, I think I will anyway. See ya. And the angel says something interesting. He says, no. Continue on your path, but when you arrive, tell Balak you will only speak what God tells you to speak. He asks what he wants and how much he's paying, and Balak hires him. And then Balak tells him to come with him to a certain mountain peak, and he looks over the land where he can see both Israel and Moab, and he instructs him to curse Israel. So Balaam says, well, prepare an altar, get an animal ready to sacrifice, and I'm going to go away and pray. And when I come back, I will deliver the words as God tells me to speak. He comes back, Balak does all this, he comes back and he blesses Israel instead. This happened 3 times, and the 3rd time, and by the way, he's thinking he's going to get paid for all 3 trips. This is amazing arrogance, but still, God is speaking through him. I mean, there's a message right there. I'm not preaching it today. But instead of cursing Israel, he says this, "How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob. How beautiful are your dwelling places, O Israel." This is now the reading that we heard this morning. "Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, and like cedars beside the waters." But then Balaam goes on and tells him what God is going to do to him, since he was determined to curse Israel and not change his course, not adapt to what he understood was already happening before his eyes. And he prophesies Moab's destruction because Balak would not heed this God he was encountering and would not turn himself or his nation around to worship the Lord, rather than submit to what apparently this king had come to know was the true God. He was willing to suffer that and take the chance rather than surrender to God's will. He was that obstinate. Who else in the history of Scripture do we remember had that kind of arrogance? Ramses II, Ramses II, who when confronted by Moses was confronted 10 times, and it said, and constantly he hardened his heart against God, even though he was watching his nation fall apart. There are people like that who will not humble themselves and bend themselves to the change that is most obviously before them.